Before the first champagne glass was raised, before the string quartet began its opening waltz, before 400 guests turned their heads toward the cathedral doors, a voice from the back of the room said 7 words that stopped a wedding cold. "I believe my invitation said +1. She wasn't alone. She had brought 4. They stood behind her like columns of granite. 4 men in black suits with earpieces and jawlines that looked like they had been carved for the sole purpose of telling other men to sit down. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply stood there, filling the doorway with a silence that was louder than the music had been. The bride dropped her bouquet. The groom, a man who had built a $90 million empire on fear and the careful application of violence, who had ordered the disappearance of a federal informant without raising his voice, stood at the altar and felt something he had not permitted himself to feel since he was a child. He felt afraid, not of the men behind her, not of the attention. He was afraid because the woman standing in the doorway was supposed to be broken. He had spent the last 3 years making sure of it. He had taken her home, her money, her dignity, her friends, her confidence, and her belief that she was worth anything more than the dirt beneath his handmade Italian shoes. And yet, there she stood, not broken, not bent, not begging. She stood in the entrance of the Cathedral of Saint-Miret in a black dress that fit her like a declaration of war, with her chin raised and her eyes locked on his, and she smiled. Not a warm smile, not a bitter one, the smile a woman gives when she has already won and the man just doesn't know it yet. Dominic Rashich gripped the edge of the altar, and the guests who had come to celebrate his new beginning realized, in the span of a single breath, that they were about to witness something else entirely. The Cathedral of Saint-Miret sat at the crown of Velmore Hill, a limestone fortress of old money and older silence. It had been built in 1887 by a shipping magnate who wanted God to notice him from a distance, and it succeeded. The spire rose 190 feet above the city, visible from the harbor, from the financial district, from the low-slung neighborhoods in the eastern wards where people worked double shifts and never once set foot inside its doors. The cathedral was not a place of worship in any meaningful sense. It was a stage. The windows depicted saints in postures of suffering, their faces tilted upward, their hands open, as if they had been waiting centuries for someone to explain why beauty and pain so often lived in the same house. Today, every pew was filled. The women wore hats, the men wore watches. The flowers, white orchids and pale roses, had been flown in from a private greenhouse in the Netherlands and arranged by a florist who charged $9,000 for what she called architectural emotion. The air smelled of lilies and expensive perfume and the faint antiseptic scent of power. Everything was immaculate. Everything was controlled. Every flower, every candle, every note of music had been selected to project one message. Dominic Rashich was untouchable. His world was beautiful, and his wedding was the proof. But beauty built on control has a particular fragility to it. It doesn't bend, it shatters. And the first crack had just walked through the door. 3 years before she walked into that cathedral, Maren Isvik had signed her name on a divorce decree with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. She had sat in a windowless office in a county courthouse while a lawyer she couldn't afford told her what she was entitled to, and the answer, after 11 years of marriage to one of the most powerful men in the region, was almost nothing. Dominic's attorneys had been methodical. They had buried assets in offshore accounts, restructured holdings through shell companies, and transferred property titles to business partners who existed only on paper. By the time the proceedings were finished, the man who owned a waterfront estate, a penthouse, 3 restaurants, a construction firm, and a private collection of automobiles, worth more than some municipal budgets had, on paper, a net worth of $140,000. Maren received half. After legal fees, she walked away with $31,400 and a 7-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield. She also walked away with 2 children. Leora was 9, Bastian was 6. She had met Dominic at 23. She was waitressing at a restaurant in Velmore's Harbor District, a place called Orosi's that served overpriced seafood to men who tipped based on how closely the waitress smiled. Dominic had come in with 4 men and ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than her rent. He had looked at her with a focused attention that she had mistaken, at 23, for admiration. She would later understand it was assessment, the way a man looks at something he intends to acquire. They married when she was 25. The first year was beautiful in the way that cages are sometimes beautiful, gilded, spacious, and locked from the outside. She quit her job because Dominic said she didn't need to work. She stopped seeing her college friends because Dominic said they were beneath her now. She stopped calling her mother every Sunday because Dominic said Annika's voice irritated him, and Marraine, who had not yet learned to recognize the architecture of isolation, believed she was simply adapting to a better life. The first time he hit her, she was 27. Leora was 3 months old, asleep in the nursery upstairs. Marin had asked about a charge on the credit card. A $4,200 dinner at a restaurant she'd never heard of, and his hand had moved so fast she didn't register the impact until she was already on the floor. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't lost control. The violence was calm. It was administrative. It was a correction. He had knelt beside her afterward and said, "Don't make me explain things twice." Over the next 8 years, the pattern calcified. The hits came in cycles: tension, explosion, remorse, calm. Each cycle slightly shorter than the last. He broke her wrist when Leora was 2 and told the emergency room she had fallen down the stairs. He fractured her cheekbone when Bastian was a year old. He never touched the children. That was his line, the line that let him believe he was not a monster, and Marin clung to it because it was the only wall between her children and the thing she had married. But the violence was only half the architecture. The other half was erasure. Dominic had removed her from the world so gradually that she hadn't noticed until there was no world left. Her phone contacts dwindled from 62 to 4. Her bank account was closed. Her driver's license expired and was not renewed. She existed entirely inside the structure Dominic had built, and the structure had no doors. When the divorce came, it was not her choice. Dominic had met someone, Petra, the daughter of a real estate developer whose family connections would open new territory for his operations. Marin was discarded the way a man discards a tool he no longer needs, without ceremony, without guilt, and with a team of lawyers whose job was to ensure the discarding was permanent. The decree gave her the children, not because Dominic wanted to be generous, but because he did not want to be inconvenienced. He signed away custody the way he signed purchase orders, without looking up. Marin moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Harrowell, on the eastern edge of Velmore. The elevator hadn't worked in 3 months. The hallway smelled of cooking oil and mildew. The lock on the front door required a specific combination of lifting and turning that Marin had taught both children to master. She found a job at a medical billing office, $16.50 an hour. She found a second job waitressing 3 evenings a week at a diner on Caldecott Street. She found a neighbor, a retired woman named Bettine, who watched the children on the nights Marin worked double shifts and refused payment in anything other than company and the occasional plate of food. Leora, who was now 12, had become the kind of child who carries too much and says too little. She packed her own lunch. She helped Bastian with his homework. She stood at the apartment window on nights when Marin worked late and watched the street until she saw her mother's headlights, and only then did she exhale. She had her mother's brown hair and her father's gray eyes, and a stillness that didn't belong on a 12-year-old. Bastian was 9. He had a gap-toothed grin that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly, like sunlight through a closing door. He collected bottle caps. He drew pictures of rockets. He asked questions constantly. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly south? Why doesn't Dad ever call? And the last question was the one Maren never answered because the truth was a blade she refused to hand to a 9-year-old boy. This was Maren Isvik's life 3 years after the divorce. 2 jobs, 2 children. An apartment with a broken elevator and a lock that required a secret. $214 in savings. A woman who had been hollowed out by a man who never once considered her human and who was now, slowly, grain by grain, filling herself back in. And then, the invitation arrived. It came on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The envelope was in the mailbox. Ivory linen stock, heavy enough to feel expensive in the hand. Her name was written across the front in calligraphy so precise, it looked mechanical. She knew who it was from the moment her fingers touched the paper. Inside was a wedding invitation, cream cardstock with gold embossing. Dominik Rasic and Petra Varnell request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony. Saturday, the 21st of October. The Cathedral of Saint-Mireille. Reception to follow at the Grand Hollow Estate. There was a handwritten note tucked behind the invitation. Dominik's handwriting. She recognized the slant, the hard downward strokes, the way he pressed the pen so deep into the paper it left grooves on the other side. 3 sentences. Maren, I want you to see what you lost. Bring the children if you like. They should see their father happy for once. She understood the invitation perfectly. It was not generosity. It was not closure. It was theater. Dominik wanted her there the way a hunter wants a mounted head on the wall, as proof of conquest. He wanted her sitting in a pew in whatever dress she could afford, watching him marry someone younger, wealthier, better connected. He wanted her humiliation to be the wedding gift he gave himself, and the line about the children, that was the cruelest part. He hadn't called them in 14 months. He had missed Bastian's birthday, Leora's school play, the parent-teacher conference where Leora's teacher had said, with careful professionalism, that Leora seemed to carry a weight that most children her age didn't carry. Dominik didn't want his children at the wedding. He wanted Maren to know that he still thought of them as possessions he had temporarily lent out, as evidence that could be recalled at any time. She went inside. Leora was at the kitchen table doing math homework. Bastian was on the floor building something out of cardboard and tape that he called a spaceship, but looked more like a mailbox with ambitions. Maren put the invitation face down on the counter. But Leora saw it. Leora always saw things. What's that? Nothing important. Leora looked at her mother with those gray eyes, the ones that had learned to read silence the way other children read books. Is it from Dad? Yes. What does he want? He wants us to come to his wedding. Bastian looked up from his spaceship. Dad's getting married? And then, with the philosophical seriousness of a 9-year-old processing information he doesn't fully understand, he asked the question that cut through every layer of pretense Maren had constructed. Does Dad love her more than he loved us? The room went silent. The refrigerator hummed. Maren knelt beside her son. Your father's ability to love, she said, choosing every word like she was crossing a river on stones, has nothing to do with how lovable you are. You are the most lovable person I have ever met. Both of you are. Bastian nodded, but his eyes didn't believe her. Not fully. Because children absorb rejection the way soil absorbs rain. Silently, deeply, and in places you can't see until something tries to grow there and can't. She folded the invitation and put it in the drawer beside the sink. She didn't know yet that she would go. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the anger and the 3 years of rebuilding herself from raw material, something had shifted. Something small and hard and bright, like a coal that has been buried so long it has forgotten it can burn. It was not revenge. Maren was not built for revenge. It was something quieter than that. something closer to the bone. It was the refusal to be erased. The invitation sat in the kitchen drawer for 6 days. Maren didn't mention it again. She went to work. She came home. She braided Leora's hair. She helped Bastian with his spelling words. She didn't mention the wedding. But the wedding mentioned itself. On the 4th night, Bastian asked at dinner. Spaghetti made from a box of pasta that cost 89 cents and a jar of sauce that cost $1.12. Whether he would need to wear a suit. Dad's wedding. Do I need a suit? Because Tommy Carrick wore a suit to his uncle's wedding and he said it was itchy, but he looked really cool in the pictures. Maren put down her fork. We haven't decided if we're going. But he invited us. That's what you do when someone invites you. You go. Maren looked at her son's face and saw, beneath the 9-year-old logic of social obligation, something else. Bastian wanted to go because Bastian wanted to see his father. 14 months of silence. 14 months of unanswered phone calls and a child waiting by the window on Christmas morning for a car that never pulled into the lot, and Bastian still wanted to go because the invitation meant his father had remembered he existed. That was the cruelty Dominic would never understand. The cruelty of giving a child just enough hope to keep the wound from closing. Leora didn't look up from her spaghetti. She wound the noodles around her fork in slow, deliberate circles, the way she did everything. Carefully, precisely, as if the world might punish her for moving too fast. Leora, do you want to go? Leora set the fork down. She looked at Maren with an expression that was so controlled, so deliberately composed, that it broke Maren's heart, because 12-year-olds should not have faces that practiced. If we go, Leora said, he's going to make us sit somewhere everyone can see us, and he's going to smile at us like he's a good dad, and people are going to think we're a normal family, and we're not. He doesn't want us there because he misses us, Mom. He wants us there because we make him look good. Maren stared at her daughter. 12 years old. And she had just articulated the exact mechanics of Dominic's cruelty with a precision that most adults never achieve. How long have you known that? Maren whispered. Since the last time he called. He asked me what grade I was in. I told him 6th. He said, already? Like I was a show he'd stopped watching and forgot what season it was on. Bastian was looking between them. So we're not going? And his voice had that tremor in it, the thin vibration of a boy who is trying very hard not to show that something matters to him because showing that something matters has not historically gone well. Because if we don't go, Bastian said, he'll think we're scared of him. And are you? Maren asked softly. Scared of him? Bastian thought about it. Really thought about it. The way children do when they decide to treat a question with the seriousness it deserves, instead of the answer that's expected. Not of him, Bastian said. Of how small he makes me feel. Maren closed her eyes. She pressed her son's hand between both of hers and held it there, over the 89-cent pasta and the table that wobbled unless you put a folded napkin under the short leg. And she made a decision. She would go. Not for Dominic. Not to perform. Not to prove anything to anyone she had never met. She would go so that her children would never have to say they were too scared to walk through a door. But she would not go alone. And she would not go unprepared. The diner on Caldecott Street was called Stavros's, after a man who had died in 1997 and whose name remained on the awning because his daughter Nina, who now ran the place, couldn't afford a new sign and didn't particularly want one. It smelled of bacon grease and bleach, and the particular kind of warmth that only exists in places where people come to sit alone and not be bothered. Maren worked Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday evenings. She wore a blue apron that had a grease stain near the left pocket that no amount of washing could remove. And then there was the woman who sat in booth 4. She came in every Tuesday at 7:15. She ordered black coffee and a plain omelet. She sat with her back to the wall, which Maren noticed because Maren also sat with her back to the wall whenever she had the choice. It was a habit shared by people who had learned that doors were not always used by friendly visitors. The woman was perhaps 55. Her hair was silver white, cut short and severe. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they had a quality of stillness that Marin recognized. Not the stillness of calm. The stillness of someone who had learned to watch everything without appearing to watch anything. Her name, according to the credit card she paid with, was Ines Korova. On the Tuesday after the invitation arrived, Marin was carrying a pot of coffee to booth 4 when her hand trembled. Not from weakness, but from the residue of a conversation she'd had with Bastian that morning before school. He had asked, standing in the doorway with his backpack hanging off one shoulder, "Mom, do you think Dad will talk to me at the wedding? Like, actually talk to me? Not the way he talks on the phone, where he asks how school is, and then says he has to go before I finish answering." Marin's hand shook, and coffee spilled across the table in booth 4, pooling against the newspaper and the edge of the saucer. "I'm so sorry," Marin said. "Sit down," the woman said. It wasn't a command. It was the blunt recognition that something is wrong, and the speaker is not willing to pretend otherwise. Marin sat. "You've been shaking for 3 shifts," Ines said. "Tuesday before last, your hands were steady. Last Tuesday, they weren't. Tonight, they're worse. Something happened." Marin opened her mouth to say the automatic words. "I'm fine." The heirloom words that every woman in her position has inherited from every woman who came before her. But they didn't come out. Because this woman was not asking so that Marin could tell her she was fine and everyone could move on. This woman asked because she intended to do something with the real answer. "My ex-husband invited me to his wedding," Marin said. "He wants me there so he can humiliate me. And I have 2 children who want to go because they think it means their father remembers they exist." Ines picked up her coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it down. "What was his name?" "Dominik Rasic." Something changed in the woman's face, not a flinch, more like a door closing, the practiced shift of someone who has trained themselves to control what their face reveals. "I know that name," Ines said, "not the way most people do." She paused. She folded the stained newspaper and set it aside with the careful precision of a person who values order, not because they love it, but because disorder once carried consequences. "My husband's name was Sergei Korova. He ran an organization in the eastern districts for 23 years. He was a man of great charm and no conscience. He could make a room full of people believe he was the kindest man alive, and then he would go home and break a woman's fingers for putting too much salt in the soup." She said it without emotion, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had felt it so many times that the feeling had been refined into something harder, something with edges. "I was married to Sergei for 19 years. I ran his household. I organized his dinner parties. I smiled at the wives of men who did terrible things, and I went home, and I lay in bed beside a man who had hit me 3 hours earlier, and I stared at the ceiling, and I counted the hours until morning because surviving was all I knew how to do. Sergei died 11 years ago, heart attack. The paramedics found him on a bathroom floor with his phone in his hand. He was trying to call his lawyer, not his wife, not his sons, his lawyer. Because even in death, Sergei Korova's first instinct was to protect his assets." Ines looked at Marin directly. Her dark eyes held something that Marin recognized instantly, the way you recognize your own handwriting on a page you don't remember writing. Recognition, not sympathy, not pity. The specific understanding of one woman who has lived inside a particular kind of prison, looking at another woman who has lived inside the same one. "After Sergei died, I took what he left, the money, the connections, the infrastructure, and I turned it into something else. I funded shelters. I built a legal aid network. I established a foundation that provides emergency resources to women leaving violent homes. I did not do it out of goodness. I did it because I was furious. And fury, when it is precise, is the most productive force on earth. You said he invited you to his wedding to humiliate you, Ines said, and you're thinking about going. I'm thinking about not being afraid to go. Ines studied her. Then something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Something more specific. The expression of a woman who has been looking for something without knowing she was looking for it, and has just found it sitting across from her in a diner booth. Then you won't go alone. And you won't go unprepared. And when you walk through that door, every person in that cathedral will see something that Dominic Rashich has spent his entire life making sure no one ever sees. What? A woman he couldn't destroy. They met twice before the wedding. The first meeting was at a coffee shop on the north side of Velmore. Ines arrived first. Tell me about the wedding, Ines said before Marin had even sat down. No greeting. No small talk. Ines used silence the way a carpenter uses a level to measure whether something was true. Marin told her everything. The cathedral. The guest list of business associates and political contacts. The reception at Grand Hollow Estate. The bride, Petra Varnell, whose father's real estate empire would give Dominic access to development contracts across the county. This isn't a wedding, Ines said. It's a consolidation. He's merging operations with the Varnell family and using the ceremony as a press conference. And I'm the entertainment. You were meant to be. But Dominic wrote his script assuming you would play the part he assigned you, the broken ex-wife in a cheap dress, sitting in the back row. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer. We're going to rewrite the script. I don't want revenge. I'm not offering revenge. Revenge is noise. What I'm offering is clarity. There's a difference between punishing a man and refusing to be diminished by him. One is about him. The other is about you. The second meeting was the night before the wedding at the office of a personal security firm called Cormorant Group. Discreet, licensed, and run by a woman named Hadija Okonma, who had spent 15 years in military intelligence before entering the private sector. Hadija was tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and eyes that assessed everything in a room within 4 seconds. She shook Marin's hand with a grip that was firm but not competitive. 4 men, Hadija said without preamble. Licensed, unarmed, communication-equipped. Their job is not to fight. Their job is to be seen. Why 4? Because Dominic Rashich controls rooms through presence. Everyone at that wedding will be operating under the assumption that he is the most powerful person in the building. 4 men changes that assumption. Not with violence, with geometry. When you walk through those doors, every person in that cathedral will have to recalculate who they're looking at. Ines placed a folder on the table. Inside, a photograph of a black dress on a tailor's form, floor length, structured at the shoulders, owing nothing to fashion and everything to architecture. And a handwritten note in Ines's precise script. You will walk in last. You will walk in slow. You will not speak until spoken to. And when you speak, every word will be a door that he cannot close. Marin looked at the note. I can't afford any of this. Sergei left me resources. I spent 11 years deciding what they were for. They are for women who stand up in rooms where they were expected to sit down. What about the children? Marin asked. He invited them too. Ines was quiet for a moment. Your children are not props. Not his and not yours. They don't belong in that room. Not because they're weak, but because that room is a stage, and children should not have to perform in their father's theater. Marin had known this already. She had known it from the moment Leora said, "He wants us there because we make him look good." But hearing it from Ines made the decision solid. Bettine would stay with them. The children would be safe. And Marin would walk through that door carrying nothing but herself, which was enough. Which had always been enough. That night, she sat on the edge of Bastian's bed while he slept. She watched his hand curl around the edge of his pillow, the fingers still small, still soft, still belonging to a boy who collected bottle caps and wanted his father to talk to him at a wedding. She bent down and kissed his forehead. "You will never feel small again," she whispered. "I promise." Bastian didn't stir. But Leora, lying in the next bed with her eyes open because Leora always had her eyes open, heard every word. And in the darkness of that apartment, a 12-year-old girl who had spent her entire life watching and waiting and holding still felt something she had not felt since before she could remember. She felt safe, not because the danger was gone, but because her mother was walking toward it instead of away from it. Saturday, October 21st. The sky over Velmore was the color of brushed steel. By 2 o'clock, the cathedral was full. 400 guests sat in rows of dark mahogany, arranged by hierarchy rather than affection. The front rows held family and inner circle. The back rows held people invited because not inviting them would have been noticed. Dominic stood at the altar in a charcoal suit tailored in Milan. His best man, a thick-necked associate named Ferenz, stood to his right, with the rings in his jacket pocket, and an expression that suggested he had attended many ceremonies in his life, but had never once been moved by one. Petra Varnell waited in the vestry. Her dress had cost $42,000. Her father, Gregor Varnell, sat in the front row with his wife, both wearing expressions of satisfied investment. This wedding was a merger. The dress was the signing bonus. At 2:15, the officiant took his position. At 2:16, the cathedral doors opened. Everyone expected the bride. They got something else. The afternoon sun, which had been hiding behind the overcast sky all morning, chose that exact moment to break through, and it poured through the open doors in a single wide column of pale gold, flooding the center aisle and turning every particle of dust into a floating spark. And then Maren Isvik stepped into the light. She wore the black dress, floor-length, structured, clean. It moved with her the way shadows move with objects, attached, fluid, inevitable. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was bare. She wore no jewelry. She carried nothing. Her hands were at her sides, open, unhurried. The hands of a woman who had come not to take anything but to return something, his expectation of her diminishment, and leave it at his feet. Behind her, the 4 men entered the cathedral, 2 flanking her, 2 behind. Their suits were black, their posture military, and their faces professionally blank. Their presence was the scan. Every person in every pew felt it, the atmospheric shift that happens when a new variable enters an equation that everyone thought was already solved. The string quartet stopped playing, not because anyone told them to, because the cellist looked up, saw the woman and the men in the doorway, and her bow stopped mid-stroke the way a sentence stops when someone more important starts talking. Heads turned. The turn rippled forward from the back rows like a wave through water. Maren walked down the center aisle. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She walked the way a woman walks when she has spent 3 years learning how to stand inside her own body again. Her heels struck the stone floor in a rhythm that was steady, measured, and absolute. Each step echoed off the limestone walls and the vaulted ceiling and the stained glass windows where saints looked down with their painted faces and, for once, seemed to be paying attention. Guests whispered. Some recognized her. The ex-wife. The one who was supposed to be sitting in the back row in a department store dress, looking at the floor. Instead, she was walking down the center aisle flanked by men whose very existence in this room asked a question no one in Dominic's organization had prepared to answer. Who is protecting her? And why does she need protection from the groom? Dominic watched her come. His face did not change. That was his training. But his hands changed. His right hand, resting on the lectern, tightened until the tendons stood out beneath his skin. She was not supposed to look like this. She was supposed to look beaten. Instead, She looked like a woman who had been through fire and had come out not scarred, but forged. Marin reached the 6th row. She stopped. There were 3 empty seats at the end. Dominic had placed them deliberately, 1 for her and 2 for the children he assumed she'd bring, ensuring that if she came, she would sit among his people, enclosed in his territory. She did not sit. Not yet. She stood at the edge of the pew and looked directly at Dominic for the first time. She held his gaze for 5 full seconds. No fear, no anger, no plea, no performance. The expression of a woman seeing a man clearly, perhaps for the first time, and finding that what she saw no longer had the power to make her look away. Then she sat down. The 4 men took positions. 2 in the pew behind her. 2 standing at the end of the row, hands folded, visible to everyone. They were not guarding Marin from a physical threat. They were redefining the room. They were saying, without words, that whatever Dominic Rashich had planned for this moment had just been revised without his permission. The string quartet resumed. The music continued. But the room had not recovered. And in the vestry, Petra Varnell, who had been watching through a crack in the door, turned to her maid of honor and asked a question she had not expected to ask on her wedding day. "Who is that woman?" The maid of honor said nothing, because the answer would have been the one thing no bride wants to hear. That's the woman he never got over destroying, and she just walked in like she owns the room. The ceremony proceeded. Dominic said, "I do," with the clipped efficiency of a man signing a contract. Petra said, "I do," with a voice that trembled. The kiss at the altar was brief, functional, the kind that communicates ownership rather than affection. Marin watched it from the 6th row with her hands folded in her lap and her face perfectly still. She felt nothing. That surprised her. She had expected jealousy, grief, rage, but there was nothing. Just the quiet understanding that the man at the altar was a stranger. Not because she didn't know him, because she finally did. The reception was held at Grand Hollow Estate. Crystal chandeliers, a 12-piece band, champagne that cost more per glass than Marin earned in an hour at the billing office. Marin moved through the reception slowly, visibly, without seeking anyone out. She accepted a glass of water. She stood near the windows overlooking the garden. She simply existed in the space, and the space rearranged itself around her. People came to her. A woman with diamonds at her throat. "You must be Marin. I've heard so much about you." "I doubt that," Marin replied, pleasantly. "Dominic doesn't talk about things he's finished with." The woman blinked. The smile recalibrated. She excused herself. And then, 45 minutes into the reception, Dominic came to her. He crossed the ballroom with the slow stride of a man accustomed to rooms parting for him. Conversations paused. The band kept playing, but quieter. Dominic stopped 3 feet from Marin. His champagne glass was full. His face was composed, but his eyes had the sharp, contracted quality of a man looking at something he cannot categorize, and the inability to categorize it is making him furious. "You look well," he said. His voice was low, calibrated for intimacy. The voice he had used on their first date. The same voice he had used after he hit her for the first time, kneeling beside her on the kitchen floor. "I am well," Marin said. "The men at the door, whose idea was that?" "Mine. I didn't know you had friends with those resources. You didn't know a lot of things about me, Dominic. That was by design. Yours." The sentence landed the way a key slides into a lock, precisely, mechanically, and with the unmistakable click of something opening that had been closed. "You were invited as a courtesy," he said. "No, I was invited as a prop. You wanted me in the back row looking grateful. You wanted every person in this room to look at me, and then look at Petra, and congratulate you on the upgrade." She took a breath. Steady. Measured. "But I'm not a prop, Dominic. I'm not a chapter you closed. I am a woman who survived you. And I'm standing in this room not because you invited me, but because I decided to come. There's a difference. And I think, for the first time in your life, you can see it. Something behind his face shifted, invisible on the surface, catastrophic underneath. Because Marin was right. He could see it. The woman standing in front of him was not the woman he had hit. Not the woman he had erased from her own life one phone contact at a time. This was someone who had been built from the wreckage of the person he had destroyed, and who had been built stronger. You should go, he said quietly. I'll leave when I'm ready. And Dominic, the next time you think about sending an invitation to remind someone how powerless they are, make sure they still are. She turned and walked toward the window. She did not look back. Behind her, Dominic Rashich stood in the middle of his own reception, holding a glass of champagne he could no longer taste, surrounded by people who were all pretending they hadn't just witnessed the exact moment a man's mythology cracked in half. The crack spread slowly. It started with the women, the wives, the girlfriends, the daughters. They had seen Marin walk down the aisle. They had seen the bodyguards. They had seen Dominic cross the ballroom and walk away, with the rigid posture of a man trying to hold together something already coming apart. And now they whispered. In the coded language women in dangerous rooms have always used, tilted heads, lowered voices, sentences that start with, "Did you see?" and end with a silence that says more than the words preceding it. Each whisper was a thread being pulled from the fabric of the story Dominic had spent years constructing. The story in which Marin was the discarded past and leaving her was an act of progress. But Marin had just rewritten that story by standing in the middle of it and refusing to be a minor character. Petra noticed. She stood near the bar, watching her new husband across the room. She turned to her maid of honor, a woman named Celine, who was the only person present not afraid of giving her an honest answer. What did he do to her? You don't want to know that today. I want to know it especially today. He hurt her. For years. And then he threw her away. And today he invited her here to watch, because he wanted her to see that she had been replaced. Petra looked at Marin, standing by the window with a glass of water, looking out at the garden with an expression of complete calm. She doesn't look replaced, Petra said softly. She looks like the only real person in this room. Across the ballroom, Gregor Varnell had cornered one of Dominic's associates. This was supposed to be a demonstration of stability. My daughter just married into this family, and the ex-wife walks in like she's conducting an inspection. By the time the cake was cut, the fractures had become visible. Guests who had been laughing too loudly were now laughing at the right volume. Men who had been clapping Dominic on the shoulder were keeping a professional distance. And Dominic felt the room pulling away from him. Not physically, atmospherically. The room knew something it hadn't known 2 hours ago. It knew he had invited the woman he had abused to his wedding to humiliate her. And it knew she had walked in and humiliated him instead. Not with a scene, not with accusations, simply by being present, by being whole, by looking at him without flinching. His power was not strength. It was control, and control only works on people who let it. Marin left the reception at 8:47 p.m. No announcement, no goodbye. She finished her water, set the glass on a table, and walked toward the door. One of the bodyguards, a man named Tovian, who had not spoken a single word all evening, held the door open. As she passed, he gave a slight nod. The nod of a man who had seen something worth respecting. The October air hit her face, cold and clean and smelling of wet stone and the distant salt of the harbor. Marin stood on the front steps and breathed, deep, raw, all the way to the bottom. And then she laughed. Not loudly, not bitterly, the quiet laugh of a woman who has just realized that the thing she had been most afraid of, being seen, being measured, being judged, had happened. And she was still standing. She was still whole. She was still Maren. The drive back to Harrowell took 22 minutes. She climbed the stairs. She performed the secret of the lock. Lift, turn, push. And the door opened. Bettine was on the couch. Bastian was asleep on the floor beside her, his bottle cap collection scattered around him like the debris field of a very small, very peaceful explosion. Leora was sitting at the kitchen table with a book open, but she wasn't reading. She was waiting. She looked up when Maren walked in. Her gray eyes scanned her mother's face, quickly, thoroughly, reading for damage. How was it? It was fine. Did he say anything to you? Yes. Did it hurt? Maren sat down across from her daughter. No. For the first time, something your father said to me didn't hurt. Leora studied her. 12 years of reading rooms and measuring silences had made Leora one of the most perceptive people Maren had ever known. She looked at her mother now, and what she saw made her expression change. Not dramatically. The way a window changes when the sun comes through it. The same glass, but suddenly full of light. You mean it, Leora said. I mean it. Leora stood up. She walked to her mother and put her arms around her and held on. Not the way a child hugs for comfort. The way one person holds another when they finally believe the worst is over. Maren held her back. She held her daughter in the kitchen of an apartment with a broken elevator and a table that wobbled and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly, and she thought, this is what a mansion feels like. Bastian stirred on the floor. He opened one eye, saw his mother, and smiled the gap-toothed grin that came and went like sunlight. Mom, how was Dad's wedding? It was just a party, sweetheart. Did they have cake? They had cake. Did you bring me some? She hadn't. But she would remember, weeks later, that Bastian's first question about his father's wedding was whether there was cake, and she would love him so fiercely for that simplicity that it would bring tears to her eyes in the cereal aisle of a grocery store on a random Wednesday morning. Bettine left quietly. At the door, she paused. You look different, she said. Do I? You look like yourself. Maren locked the door. She turned the deadbolt. She listened to the sound of the latch sliding into place and felt, in that small mechanical click, ownership. Of the lock, of the door, of the silence. Of every morning that would follow in which she would wake up in a home she had chosen, in a life she had built. And no one, no man, no memory, no invitation on ivory linen stock, would have the power to make her feel like a guest in her own existence. She turned off the kitchen light. She kissed Leora's forehead. She went to bed. And for the first time in a very long time, Maren Isvik slept without dreaming. 3 months passed. January came to Velmore the way it always did. Slowly, coldly, with a gray determination that made the city look like a photograph of itself. Maren's life did not change dramatically. She still worked at the billing office. She still waitressed at Stavros's. She still climbed the stairs because the elevator still didn't work. But something had shifted. Not in the circumstances, in the architecture. Leora had started smiling more. At breakfast, when Bastian said something ridiculous. At the kitchen table, when Maren helped her with a history essay. At night, when Maren braided her hair and Leora leaned back into her mother's hands with a trust that was new and fragile and growing. Bastian had stopped asking when his father would call. He had simply, quietly, redirected the part of himself that had been waiting for a phone that never rang toward things that were actually there. His bottle cap collection had expanded. He had started drawing entire solar systems on sheets of paper taped together. He had asked Maren if he could take a science class at the community center on Saturdays, and Maren had said yes before checking whether she could afford it. And then she had found a way, because some things are more important than arithmetic. She had seen Ines once since the wedding. Over coffee, Ines had told her the Korova Foundation had created a scholarship fund for children of domestic violence survivors. Marin had started to argue. Ines had raised one hand and said, "It's not charity, it's infrastructure. These children will build things. I'm investing in the foundation they stand on." On a Tuesday evening in late January, Marin was working her shift at the diner. The bell above the door rang. Cold air swept across the floor. A woman walked in with 2 children. The woman's face was pale. Her coat was too thin for the weather. She had a purse clutched against her body the way people clutch things when they're afraid of losing them. Not the purse itself, but what it represents. The last of what they have. The older child, a girl of maybe 8, held the younger one's hand. The younger one, a boy of perhaps 4, had his thumb in his mouth and was staring at the diner with wide, uncertain eyes. The woman stood in the doorway, scanning the room. Her eyes moved the way Marin's eyes used to move, quickly, involuntarily, measuring every man, calculating distance to the exits, assessing threat in a single glance. Marin recognized that scan. She recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection in a window you weren't expecting to pass. She set the coffee pot down. She walked to the doorway. She looked at the woman, and the woman looked at her, and in the space between them passed a kind of knowledge that required no words. The knowledge of one woman who has lived inside a particular kind of silence looking at another woman who is still inside it. "Table for 3?" Marin asked. Her voice was warm, not the professional warmth of a waitress, the warmth of someone who has been exactly where you are and is standing on the other side of it. The woman's eyes filled. She nodded. Marin led them to the booth in the corner. The booth where, months ago, a silver-haired woman had told her she wouldn't go alone. She brought crayons for the children without being asked. She brought water for the woman. She set down a menu and said, "Take your time. There's no rush here." The boy reached for a crayon and began drawing on the paper placemat. A house. 4 walls, a triangle roof, a door. And in front of the door, 3 stick figures. A tall one and 2 small ones. No father in the picture. Marin watched him draw. She thought of Bastian and his rockets. She thought of Leora and her gray eyes. She thought of a cathedral where she had walked down the aisle not as a bride, but as something more important, as a woman who had refused to disappear. She thought of Ines, sitting in booth 4 with her black coffee. Fury, when it is precise, is the most productive force on earth. And Marin understood, standing in a diner on Caldecott Street with a coffee pot in her hand and a blue apron with a grease stain that would never come out, that this was what Ines had meant. Not the wedding, not the bodyguards, not the confrontation or the dress. This moment. A woman in a doorway, a child with a crayon, a booth in the corner, a voice that says, "Take your time," because the opposite of abuse is not revenge. The opposite of abuse is a door that's open when you need it, and a person on the other side who knows exactly what you've been through because she's been through it herself. Marin poured the woman a cup of coffee. She set it down gently. She put her hand on the table, not on the woman's hand, but near it. Close enough to say, "I'm here." Close enough to say, "You're not alone." She picked up the coffee pot. She went back to work. The diner hummed. The cook rang the bell. Nina argued with someone on the phone. And somewhere in a 2-bedroom apartment in Harrowell, a deadbolt held faithfully in its locked position, keeping the door shut against a world that had once been too dangerous to live in. But not anymore. Not for them. Not today.